Big Ten is getting even bigger. A momentous day in the history of the nation's oldest athletic conference as West Coast powers, Oregon and Washington, accept invitations to join the Big Ten next season. The conference planted a flag out west a year ago. Today, it doubled down on that geographic news, now boasting arguably the West Coast's four biggest athletic brands. Welcome in to our coverage here on the Big Ten Network. Dave Revson and Jake Butt. Going to have a ton of guests here to add perspective on this huge day. Oregon and Washington joining. And Jake, I think right off the top, just have to turn and look at what's behind us. Last year, of course, we went from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now it's nearly from the border of Mexico to the border of Canada. It is amazing the reach now of this conference. Your thoughts on a year ago? I think it was a jaw-dropping day. This one, a little more anticipated, given the way that the Pac-12 has slowly eroded here over the last week.
I got that feeling in my stomach on like Christmas Eve, right, where there's just exciting news on the horizon. We've been following this over the past day, couple days, past couple hours, and then finally confirming it. And you mentioned, looking at that graphic, those brands, what they mean. And we were talking about it in the pre-show, having the Big Ten Conference emblem right there. I'm excited. I'm excited as an analyst to cover these games and welcome them to our conference, but as a player too, for these guys, the chance to play in some of these premier matchups going forward. Excited is almost an understatement.
Some amazing venues. You're talking about an Oregon football program that is among the 10 winningest this century in college football. Washington among the 20 winningest programs of all time. So some great pedigree with these programs as well. Going to get the first of our many guests on right now. Bruce Feldman of Fox Sports and The Athletic joins us now. And Bruce, let's talk first about this day, because this day to me was crazy with the ups and downs. I mean, the reports early in the day were that this might not happen. Then the reports were that it was going to happen. And then, of course, ultimately it did. Give us a sense in terms of what you know of the ebbs and flows of what turned out to be kind of a one-day roller coaster ride.
Yeah, about 24 hours ago from now, Dave, I remember talking to somebody and it felt like, okay, this is happening and it's going to go in this direction, because you're going to get two, as you guys both said, real legit national brands with elite football programs at a cut rate. And it was going to work out from a TV standpoint. It was going to work out from a timing standpoint. I would disagree with what you said about the Pac-12 a bit ago. It was rapidly dissolving in front of us, not just like
eroding was an understatement. Change. Yeah. All right, that's fair.
And so it was going in that direction, and then I had woke up and I had seen some news reports or some tweets that were talking about how people inside the Pac-12 are, quote, cautiously optimistic this morning. They've been cautiously optimistic for months, and I think they've been waiting and really disappointed by how the leadership has managed its negotiations from a TV standpoint, and just kind of baffled by it at the same time. And finally, these two schools felt like, hey, we cannot afford to pass this situation up. And this is a huge deal in terms of, there's a lot of this, I think, obviously scheduling wise, is going to have to change for a year from now in terms of what they were going to put on the field. But I also think it does give USC and UCLA travel partners, not just in football, but in other sports. And I think the timing of this in terms of the money, on the next deal, which is whatever, 7 years from now, I think then they come in as a full partner. But to get these two schools and these two brands and these two markets, quite honestly, because Seattle's obviously a big TV market as well, I think that's really significant for the Big Ten as a powerhouse from that standpoint.
Yeah, no doubt. Adding two top 25 television markets in terms of size in the U.S. You used the term a moment ago, cut rate, and you were talking a little bit about the financial arrangement. What do we know definitively at this point, Bruce, in terms of what this deal means financially for the conference and then by extension for each one of these schools?
Yeah, I think it starts out in the 30s, the low 30s, and then it will kind of gradually escalate a little bit to the end of the deal. But again, I think we're talking about 2030 before the next deal. But so look at it from this standpoint, if you're Oregon or Washington, you are going to probably be left with a TV deal or some kind of digital deal that was going to bring in south of $30 million from my understanding. And then you also run the risk, and I think this was a legitimate concern for them, of how are we going to recruit this way if less people are going to see our product? We're just not going to be out there as much. Because right now, I mean, Washington just had a terrific first year under Kalen DeBoer. Same thing with Dan Lanning and Oregon. They are both recruiting well. But if they all of a sudden now are going to get marginalized from an exposure standpoint, I think that was a big problem for them as they assessed everything. So look, there's a lot of stuff that I think still needs to be sorted out on some of the micro aspects of this. But I just think from that standpoint, like, you know, if you're Oregon, and I brought this up to somebody earlier today, you know, we know Phil Knight, the biggest booster out there, is up in his 80s, and I've always heard that the one thing he wants to see while he's still alive is Oregon finally win a national title in football. You know, maybe there's an easier path coming out of what was left of the Pac-12 the next couple of years, but I think it was going to diminish their opportunities going forward.
That is interesting, right? You think about the highest ranked teams in each one of those conferences making it to the college football playoff, the highest ranked champions of each conference. Certainly the path would have been easier, as you say, in a diminished Pac-12 than it would be in an 18-team league. But again, they have a lot of confidence in their brand. I almost hesitate to ask you this last question here, Bruce, because I don't want you to end up like on Old Takes Exposed or anything like that. But do you think the Big Ten is done at this point?
I would think it's done. I don't know what makes more sense from a TV standpoint to shoehorn this in. At least from a going west, I think it's done. I don't know if there's like the ACC right now is a huge mess with its grant of rights issues and where Florida State is. I don't know how some of that stuff is going to play out. I don't know if anybody knows, because you're talking about potential court battles, and there's just a lot of, you know, there's unusual stuff that goes on in realignment. This is next level unusual that seems to be going on with the ACC. So I don't know. I think right now the Big Ten is in a really, really good place with what they've added, because we're talking about, by the way, you know, Ohio State won a national title. The team they had to beat to do it is now in the conference, right? And Washington was in the playoff not that long ago with Chris Peterson. So I think they're in a really good position. I think at one point you have to wonder, are we adding to get better? And I'm not sure who they would necessarily add, if it was unwieldy, or how it would play out in terms of, you know, how the money and the exposure all comes together.
Yeah, to your point, these are the two Pac-12 teams that have played in the college football playoff, Oregon and Washington. And as you mentioned, the Ducks playing for two national championships, one in the CFP and one in the old BCS. Bruce, great stuff. Really appreciate it. And obviously, we will keep in touch with you as all of this unfolds.
Thank you, guys. My pleasure.
So here's what's going on now in the realignment world. We had UCLA and USC that we've known about for a year joining the Big Ten in 2024. Oregon and Washington added to that group. The Big 12 seems to be very much in flux. We know about BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF. They actually begin competition this year. Now there, of course, seems to be a distinct possibility that Arizona and Utah and Arizona State would join that league at some point as well. And then we already know about the SEC, Oklahoma and Texas. That kind of started this whole process when those two were added to the SEC. So what is the Big Ten getting in Oregon and Washington? In Oregon, they're getting a school of just under 20,000, 34 all-time national championships. They are a dominant running school. It is important to note that 32 of their NCAA championships have come in track and cross country, have had some great Olympians through the years. And then Washington, a significantly larger school, 11 all-time national championships, some great Olympians as well. Boys in the Boat, of course, that was Washington. They have a great crew program, but we're focused on football right now here, Jake, and we'll talk about the ramifications for some of the Olympic sports and for basketball later in the show. But at first blush, based on what we heard from Bruce, what you saw there, what stands out here?
Well, it almost encapsulates what stands out even goes all the way back to last year, going back to Oklahoma and Texas, of this changing landscape in college football. This thing has been set in motion for a while now. And of course, there was uncertainty. And now to have it confirmed that you're adding this, it feels like a big move, and yet there's still uncertainty in the future. Is what are the next moves going forward? When we added USC and UCLA, there was the question of travel. There was the question of the non-revenue generating sports. This is a move that helps answer some of those questions as well. And then another piece that Bruce mentioned was the path to winning a national championship. It was a goal of Phil Knight to see Oregon win a national championship. And you can make the argument that, the Pac-12 might be an easier path as it stands right now. To me, it's an easier path to get into the dance.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't mean anything to your ceiling. And actually joining the Big Ten, I think, helps your ceiling for every reason he said. From a recruiting standpoint, now we obviously have NIL, and that's exploding. So just being on national coverage, joining the Big Ten fan bases, the exposure both these schools are going to get is a perfect marriage.
I mean, I think you make a really interesting point. It's a harder sell to a recruit when you're in that conference that has, again, seen its quality diminish, versus being in a premier conference like the Big Ten clearly is, the largest conference now in the history of college football, and one with incredible brands. As a player, as someone who's been recruited to the highest level programs in the country, ultimately obviously ended up playing at Michigan, what's the appeal here to playing in a conference as broad and powerful as this one?
Listen, it's an honor every time you take the field. It's an honor to strap on your helmet and play the game. But there's no denying the fact that when there's a game with greater implications outside of just that specific Saturday, you get up for it. You get excited for it. The week of the practice leading up to it, when you're walking around entering class, there's a different buzz to it. And again, both these teams as they stand this year, I mean, they're in that national title college football playoff conversation. They're in great positions. And now you get the chance to do that on a week in, week out basis. We're going to see some amazing matchups. And as a player, as a competitor, that just adds to the excitement.
I agree with you in terms of this year. I mean, these programs, you look at what Dan Lanning did at Oregon, coming over from Georgia and really getting that thing going again in just a year's time. Kalen DeBoer, I mean, Michael Penix is a Heisman Trophy candidate this year. So these are both programs that are on excellent footing as they prepare for a final year in the Pac-12 and then to enter the Big Ten.
Yeah, and the momentum of that matters too. Like this adds to momentum, right? As a recruit, you look at branding, like, hey, what do I want to be a part of this program and everything it encapsulates? So the momentum for, just as you mentioned, two new head coaches, both have great quarterbacks as well. The chance to go build some momentum, put a stamp on a successful season, then you add that to everything you can sell about the Big Ten Conference to the recruits. They should be in position, not just in the near term, but going forward as well.
What do you think in terms of the teams that are already in the league? Take it from the perspective of someone who played at Michigan. Say you're there, say you're at any other school among the 14 currently in the league. What would be the implications of this to you? And again, knowing you're already going to play at UCLA or USC, and now the opportunity to compete against Oregon and Washington.
Well, it's going to get more challenging for some teams, that's for sure. I mean, these are for every reason we just said, these are two great football teams. So there's, and especially considering we're doing away with divisions, it's going to get more challenging. The teams in the West that had a spot guaranteed in Indy to play for the Big Ten championship, that was already going to be harder doing away with divisions. Now you add these two teams. But again, why college football, like, you start as a kid watching this on TV and you grow up watching all these big time players and say, man, I want to play in that game where your entire town, your entire state, the entire nation is watching you. So adding these two brands, when these guys play, as we mentioned, these are two top 25 TV markets. That's great exposure. So whoever it is in the conference, whatever player, whatever coach, you're going to be on nationally televised primetime games on a week in, week out basis. That's exciting.
Yeah, it's huge from that point of view, no doubt about it. You also mentioned, and we've been talking a bit about this from the perspective of the Olympic sports. I realize you played football, but there had been concern about the travel. And it feels like that gets diminished somewhat with this, that it becomes a little bit easier. And look, I spoke to people. We were at USC and UCLA this summer. I spoke with an administrator from some of the USC women's sports programs, Olympic sports, and she was saying she thought this was going to be overstated anyway, that they were going to be able to rearrange their non-conference schedule and still have maybe one more long trip than they would have had otherwise. But this now gives you some team. They're not right around the corner, right?
Right.
Well, let's look at our geography here, right? I mean, it's a ways from Eugene and Seattle to Los Angeles, but it's closer, and these are trips that they were already making. And it just feels like it gives you more ways to strategically put this together.
It buys you a little bit of insurance, really. Football, it's not going to be a huge issue with football. You play one game every single week. But some of these other sports, baseball, basketball, softball, some of the Olympic sports, where you're playing 3-4 times the amount of games in the season, that can be a lot of travel, especially you're a student athlete still. You still do have to go to classes. But now adding 2 more teams on that West Coast line, again, it's just like you mentioned, Dave, it just buys some insurance for those other sports. It's going to help them maintain that standard of a student athlete.
Again, makes sense for teams in the Big Ten on a lot of different levels, and clearly made sense for Oregon and Washington. Here is what the University of Oregon had to say about the development. Simple, straightforward. University of Oregon will join the Big Ten Conference in 2024. Hashtag Go Ducks. Joined now by Fox's lead game analyst, Joel Klatt, who joins us to talk about today's huge news. Just at first blush, Joel, as this went from a possibility here, probably over the last year, frankly, but certainly a heightened possibility over the last couple of weeks, to a reality today, your thoughts on what has transpired?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit surprising, but at the same time, I thought for the better part of the last year that there was a real path forward for the Pac-12, the 10 schools that were going to be in the Pac-12 moving forward. And, when the Big 12 got basically the lone remaining television deal out there to get, there was one slice of pie left. They got that slice of pie. It became incredibly difficult for the Pac-12 to land a media deal. And without a media deal, you don't really have, a conference. And so once the membership actually saw what was out there for them and they saw this subscription package that was laid before them in the last week, I think that's when it actually became imminent to them that there was going to need to be a lifeline somewhere. They were going to need to leave because through revenue and exposure, both of those were going to fall woefully short with the deal that was proposed to the membership in the Pac-12. And so at that point, this resurfaced. At no point in the last year did I really think that this was a possibility, Oregon and Washington to the Big Ten. But recent events kind of brought it to fruition. And at this point, a lot of people will say, like, boy, the Big Ten swoops in and we're maybe in a predatory position, but they weren't. This is much more of a lifeline. This is a lifeboat off the Titanic, if you will. And the Titanic, in this case, the Pac-12, hit the iceberg a long time ago. And at this point, it's just time to get off the deck. And the Big Ten is there to offer Oregon and Washington a lifeline. It does a couple of things. One is I think that the premium aspect of each of these football programs fit in the Big Ten. Obviously, the academics with Washington fit in the Big Ten. And it also, if you talk with some of the people around the Big Ten, they will tell you that one of the most difficult parts of the last 12 months since the USC and UCLA announcement was trying to figure out the non-revenue scheduling and how was travel going to work and what was that going to look like with basically a national conference. This alleviates some of that, not all of it, but some of that, and makes it a little bit more feasible. So from that standpoint, 12 months later after USC and UCLA, when all of a sudden the Titanic is about to go down, I think that it made more sense at this point. And to be honest, I think Oregon and Washington are incredibly grateful for what the Big Ten is offering right now.
These feel like really good fits, certainly from a football point of view. They're both programs that are in really good shape right now, relatively new head coaches, but a lot of buzz around both of them. So let's take one at a time. Give us a sense first for Oregon. The Ducks have been the higher profile of these two football programs, certainly this century. Historically, I think you would argue that is Washington. that's been the higher profile one. But give us a sense, first off, of what the Big Ten is getting with Oregon football.
I think Oregon is one of the most unsung fan bases in all of college football. I think it's an unbelievable venue at Autzen Stadium, probably one of my favorites, to be quite honest. In fact, it's very similar to Kinnick. It's loud but kind of small, great fan base, tough place to play, very unique. And it reminds me of that Iowa fan base in a lot of ways. And they have been, listen, when it comes to West Coast football, you can make a strong argument that obviously USC has had their pockets of success over the last 25 years, but really Oregon has been one of the most consistent, if not the most consistent football brand on the West Coast over the last 25 years. It's important to them. They invest in it. They have hired great coaches and invested in the staffs for each of those coaches. They recruit at a high level. And I think this is a big fit and a good fit for them in the Big Ten moving forward, in particular with the landscape that we just discussed in the last question. And then from the Washington perspective, this is a very proud program. And Husky Stadium is one of the best stadiums in the country and one of the best road trips. I can't tell you how excited Big Ten fans should be about going to these 4 locations, playing in Pasadena and Eugene and Seattle and Los Angeles. These are incredible road trips, incredible venues, and I can't wait to see how it all plays out and really integrates over the next couple of years.
No doubt. The setting for Husky Stadium is one of the great ones in all of college football, and Big Ten fans, as you say, will get a chance to perhaps make that road trip and follow their team. What does this tell you about Tony Petitti? I mean, we're talking very early in his tenure, and you're in a situation where kind of, as you said here, Joel, you had to either you make a move or you don't make a move, right? You couldn't be in a position where you said, well, we'll wait it out. We'll wait a month or even a couple weeks and see how this plays out, because these are such big-time brands, because there would be such interest in them with the Pac-12 dissolving. What does it tell us about Tony Petitti and his leadership that he made this move?
Well, I think it tells you that he is clear-eyed and able to be incredible in terms of being malleable. I think some of the greatest leaders, whether you're in sports or not in sports, are ones that understand what they're looking at and they see it with clear eyes. And that's, I think, what Tony had in this situation. He understood the landscape. He knew what was going on. And he said, listen, this is very different than 12 months ago. And there's an opportunity here to help 2 programs that will help us at the Big Ten Conference. And I would be, remiss to not look at this from a business standpoint. And now Tony's got to think to himself, listen, there's an opportunity for a 4th window of college football just in one conference. That's going to be valuable. I don't know where it lands, but I think that's something that he looked at and he saw an opportunity there and took it. But in no way did I think that Tony I talked to him at length. I mean, we did a big interview this summer. This was not on his radar. Again, it was the events that took place within the Pac-12 that led them to a breaking point. At that moment, you're either a lifeboat or you're not. And Tony saw an opportunity to be a lifeboat, bring 2 premium brands into his conference to make his conference even stronger, in particular moving forward. And he did it. And I think that it shows great, patience, resolve, execution, deal-making skills, and most importantly, those clear eyes of looking at reality and understanding what he's looking at.
Yeah, to your point, made it very clear at Big Ten Media Days he was focused on integrating USC and UCLA, wasn't thinking about expansion, but again, the events dictated a far different direction. Joel Klatt could talk about this with you for hours, but appreciate the minutes that you gave us. Thanks so much, my friend. Have a good weekend.
Absolutely. Good to see you again. And hey, season's around the corner. It's almost football time. So
absolutely.
Right?
The Big Ten making it official today with this statement. This is the beginning of what was a lengthy statement from the league. The Big Ten Council of Presidents and Chancellors voted today to admit the University of Oregon and the University of Washington to the Big Ten Conference effective August 2nd, 2024, with competition to begin in all sports for the 2024-25 academic year. With the school's admission, Oregon and Washington will also join the Big Ten Academic Alliance, a consortium of world-class research institutions dedicated to advancing their academic missions. And both these schools, of course, with fine academic reputations, both in the AAU. Andy Katz joins us now. And Andy, let's dive into this a little bit from a basketball point of view. And I think if you look in recent years, certainly Oregon has been very prominent with Dana Altman. He took them to a Final Four. Mike Hopkins has taken over at Washington. Last couple of years, a little shaky, but got off to a nice start there. Give us some insight into each one of these hoops programs.
Well, both have great history. You're right. Recently, both have struggled. Oregon has missed out the last couple. Washington, the last four. In fact, Washington went to the NCAA tournament only once so far under Mike Hopkins. That was in his second season, whereas Dana Altman has been there 7 of the 11 he's been there, including that Final Four in 2017. There's history with Oregon and Big Ten teams in the NCAA tournament. Oregon knocked out Iowa. They have played Wisconsin. There's no question, though, that talent at Oregon, certainly with the Nike influence, has been there throughout the course of Dana Altman's tenure. You can go back to when Ernie Kent was there. As for Washington, Lorenzo Romar, Mike Hopkins, they have consistently had high-level talent. Washington in the Seattle area is fertile recruiting ground. So there's no question that both these programs have great history, good rivalries with USC and UCLA. The more intriguing thing for me looking forward, Dave, is what's going to happen in 24-25. And my understanding, it's way early now, is the inkling will be to stay at 20 league games. So we could have 14 one plays, singles, and 3 teams you play twice. Who are those 3 teams? What's the men's and women's basketball tournaments going to look like, where they're going to be? I can't imagine a scenario where we're not going to see the tournament start on a Tuesday, assuming everyone does get invited. That could be a whole nother discussion. So, a lot of things are going to have to happen really quickly. As you know, we don't have basketball tournament sites after next season in Minnesota. So a lot of decisions quickly. The scheduling, obviously, in football and all the sports and men's and women's basketball is going to start happening really quickly. And the other point I want to make real quick, Dave, is that this is going to be a nightmare going forward, not just with the Big Ten going to 18, whatever that final number is in the Big 12, the SEC. In the first round of the NCAA tournament, they always try to avoid those conference matchups right off the bat. That's almost going to be impossible to avoid when we get to the NCAA tournament for the men and the women, because these conferences have so many teams.
Yes, if you end up with a dozen teams making the tournament, or maybe even more, I do think it becomes, as you say, just logistically very difficult to avoid it. Tell us about the arenas here for each one of these teams. The Matthew Knight Arena for Oregon, and then Heck Edmondson for Washington. I had the privilege of calling the women's NCAA tourney there. I think it's a great building, but for people who haven't been to either one of these buildings, give them a sense for them.
Well, I've been to both. I have to say, I love the old Oregon building. I know it needed to be redone. It kind of reminded me of the old field house at Wisconsin. I saw an unbelievable Oregon-Arizona game there years ago. It's a sweat box, but they moved on for that. Matthew Knight Arena. It's a gorgeous facility. Attendance has been shaky at times, but I'm fully confident that when the teams that, certainly the right teams come in, they'll pack it. I love Washington's. When Washington is good, I think that's one of the best home court environments, certainly on the West Coast. It is intimate. It is cozy. It's the perfect size for them. And those that have not been to that UW campus, it is absolutely spectacular. In football, you've got the water, you can see it from the stadium. And then obviously in basketball, the basketball arena is sort of right near there. And so you walk up there, it's just absolutely a gorgeous setting. And, bringing in Seattle and then the Eugene, Portland area, not easy to get to Eugene, as you know, Dave, but, there are direct flights. I think maybe from Chicago, I'm not quite sure. Certainly, from Northern California. But there's no question that bringing those markets in the general Portland area, Seattle, is a huge win-win for the Big Ten. And I was just texting with Mick Cronin, who's going to be joining, obviously, next year, the head coach at UCLA. So they're thrilled. Obviously, they have some partners that they're familiar with, but I can tell you from all these coaches, they want to be on the good side here. And I say that, and they want to be in the conference that they know is going to be around, that's got stability. And there's no question that the Big Ten has it.
Andy, you have such a great pulse on everything going on in college sports. And as you say, the Big Ten is in an advantageous position here. What does this mean for the schools left behind here? I mean, it's crazy to think right now that Stanford does not appear to have a home, a program that literally has the best overall athletic department in the country year in and year out. Berkeley, of course, finds itself in a similar situation. Washington State, Oregon State. What does this mean for those schools?
Well, there's no question that Washington State and Oregon State make sense for the Mountain West. I mean, they are much more Mountain West schools, just had a Pac-12 and prior to that Pac-10 banner behind them. So they really are more of a fit for the Mountain West, like Colorado State, Boise State. They do really fit that narrative. You know, the problem with Stanford and Cal, and I saw this last fall at the Pac-12 Media Day when I was there, with, you know, when talking to those representatives, there was just a lack of commitment to athletics and a real curiosity of, are they going to really buy in? Now, what happened with Cal was interesting because in hiring Mark Madsen, you know, potentially away from Stanford, we'll see if Jared Haas survives there long term, but they did make a commitment to basketball that they had not made under Mark Fox. So now Cal, I think, is in a little different spot than Stanford. I do think that, you know, football-wise, certainly Stanford has a chance to be an independent. They've got the history. They've got good rivalries that they've played Notre Dame and other schools like that. I can't see it with Cal. I think Cal is in a much tougher predicament of what they're going to do. Do they agree to be in the Mountain West? They've had a bit of a, you know, air superiority because it's a great academic institution in the UC system. Obviously, Cal and UCLA are the two best in that system. So Cal, I think, is in a real tough spot. Stanford, I do think, would have options as a football independent, and it's, you know, Olympic sports and men's basketball could certainly join the Mountain West or some other conference, whether it's West Coast, you name it. People are going to want their non-revenue sports because they're some of the best in the country, if not the best. But Cal's the one that I really don't know where they're going to fit if they end up just joining the Mountain West. Now that the Big Ten really, it seems like, for now, has capped it with the addition of Washington and Oregon.
That is indisputably the biggest subtext of this day. Of course, it's a great day for the Big Ten, but there is a lot of discussion about what happens to these schools and then just more broadly, the dissolution of a conference that's been around since 1915. I mean, incredible changing times here in college athletics. Andy Katz, thanks a lot for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
As we look at the timeline of expansion for the Big Ten, of course, Penn State joining in 1990, adding an 11th team to the Big Ten. Nebraska joined in 2011. That gave the Big Ten the opportunity to have a championship game in football with 12 teams. Maryland and Rutgers, that was the East Coast move in 2014. Oregon, UCLA, USC, and Washington in 2024 will constitute the West Coast move of the Big Ten. Washington Athletics at UW Athletics, very similar, concise, and to the point. As with Oregon, saying the University of Washington will join the Big Ten Conference in 2024, and then augmenting that with the hashtag Go Huskies. Jake, as you listen to Andy there, what thoughts went through your head?
Well, just and you brought this up too, Dave, the schools that are left behind, right? That's a piece of this. In college, fan bases are extremely passionate. So as great as this is for some of the schools, of course, Oregon, Washington, we're excited to welcome them to the Big Ten Conference. There is some schools that are left kind of in limbo right now, and there's really no clarity or true answers on where that's going to end up.
No, it's really tough to see, no doubt about it. And these are proud programs and proud universities. And I mean, you know, honestly, the autopsy on the Pac-12 is fascinating. I mean, I think there are going to be reams of materials here on kind of how this went wrong. A conference that was so strong and so proud historically and kind of has fallen apart, not kind of, has fallen apart here. From the Big Ten point of view, again, as you kind of hear about the addition of these programs, about going to Oregon and going to Washington, and think more broadly about the broad-based athletic programs that each one of these schools has, what stands out to you?
Well, even just to take it a slightly different direction, when we showed that graphic of even going back to 1990 with the addition of Penn State and how the Big Ten has expanded over time. You know, I wasn't even born in 1990 for that, right?
Must you go there?
I had to say it.
Yeah.
I had to say it. But I was at Michigan when Maryland and Rutgers. 2014, I was a sophomore. I remember playing both those schools when they were new. You know, 2011, I was still in high school. So whenever there's change, I just think there's a little bit of it's excitement, it's nervousness, it's okay, this is new, and there's a period where you're feeling out. But Penn State is the Big Ten now. Nebraska is the Big Ten. Maryland, Rutgers, we don't blink anymore. So there's a period of change where it is a little bit new. But if you can project 5-10 years down from the line, it's going to be all we know.
I would agree. And I was in college and actually on a board which had to consider the addition of Penn State to league, a small and inconsequential board, but we were talking about what the ramifications would be. And it did seem so foreign at that time and so crazy that Penn State would join the Big Ten. And now, as you say, you have entire generations of people who know nothing other than Penn State in the Big Ten. There is kind of this constancy of change. This is kind of the world we live in, and this is one of those changes that I think on its surface, certainly geographically, this is much different. This is much different, and it was much different a year ago because it was the first time the Big Ten had not gone to contiguous states. But now all of a sudden, as you fit these pieces together, it makes a lot more sense.
And even to say it's different on so many levels. I'm curious, I would love to talk to you sometime about what the TV deals were looking like. Like, were you guys talking about certainly not these types of numbers? And that's a big piece of this too. I mean, the way we consume content is changing, and the priority and the value of live sports, particularly football here in America, is sky high, and it's only increasing over time too. And that's where you start to see these numbers, and it has to be considered, as we heard Joel Klatt talk about. The financial aspect has to be considered.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's largely about television, right? I mean, why did the Pac-12 fall apart? I mean, it ultimately fell apart because they were not able to come up with a television deal. I mean, that's it. That's the bottom line on all of this. So again, what made sense for the Big Ten and what the right schools were for the Big Ten, obviously you feel like these four make a ton of sense. But as to why they were available, yes, I mean, that's about TV.
Yeah, and that's a piece of this too. Is Joel said, hey, this wasn't a predatory move by the Big Ten. They weren't going out and saying, hey, this was kind of something that unfolded once the Pac-12 looked at it and said, okay, these teams, this is the money you guys will have to work with. And then you see the opportunity to then join the Big Ten. I think he used the analogy of like a sinking ship, and the Big Ten was able to throw out a lifeboat to them. So it's a win-win in both situations. Also, Andy mentioned the stability of the conference for these two universities, USC and UCLA as well, to sleep easy at night because the Big Ten's safe. In fact, it's going to only get better over time.
Right, absolutely. I mean, you are in a position now where you look at the shifting landscape and you say, what can I do for my school? If you're in a leadership position in any of these
You
schools,
have to. You have
what
to.
can I do, and how can I position us to survive? And that is the decision that Oregon and Washington made here today in joining the Big Ten. Let's take a look at the football tradition at the University of Washington. I mentioned in the top 20 all-time in wins, 40 bowl games, and only 3 schools who have been to more Rose Bowls than Washington. They are USC, Michigan, and Ohio State. You see a rich tradition for the Huskies. Oregon has a very rich recent tradition in the top 10 in winning percentage this century. Kind of started to get it turned around in the mid-90s under Rich Brooks and then kind of took off from there. And they have done it with wide open offenses. And a guy who knows a thing or two about that, he was the offensive coordinator at Oregon under Chip Kelly and then took over the program himself, Mark Helfrich, who led them to the national championship game against Ohio State a number of years ago. He joins us now, a current Fox Sports analyst. And Coach, give us the Oregon perspective, first of all, on this day, what this means to the University of Oregon.
Well, to the University of Oregon specifically and their fan base, a ton of positives. The stabilizing nature of a conference like the Big Ten and probably in their minds where they should end up, along with Washington, as you just alluded to their rich history, and then just kind of inevitable. Once SC and UCLA broke, and they kind of made those threats for a long time, for many years of leaving, and they kind of finally called the bluff and weren't able to ever get that done. And some form of today in the last couple of days was I guess just the word is inevitable. Just no matter where everybody else ended up, and then sad. I think sad in a lot of ways. I heard Jake just talking about it. It's sad in a place like Pullman, Washington, or a place like Corvallis, Oregon. Those are two of the greatest venues in college football, two of the greatest campuses out there, and it remains to be seen what happens.
Tell us a little bit more about Oregon. I mean, I think we all nationally know about the brand. They have done an amazing job with branding, with uniforms. But all of that stuff only takes you so far. I mean, this has been a really good program. I mentioned you had them in the national championship game. They were in a national championship game prior to that as well this century. So they've had 2 times where they were 1 win away from winning the national title. Oregon has built this largely around offense. Give us an idea of the ethos kind of around this Oregon program and how they've gotten it going.
Well, yeah, no doubt about that. Oregon, founded the conference in 1915 with Oregon State, and then it was Washington and Cal. Those were the original 4 members, and added on here or there. And Rich Brooks kind of, would definitely be the guy that credited with coming to the forefront with, ironically, now Penn State in the same conference in that Rose Bowl game, and then Phil Knight, along with Mike Bellotti and everybody else, came together and made it what it is today. And obviously, everybody talks about the hype, and when you're there, you're always trying to earn that hype and earn that substance, the reality behind the hype. And now just a new dawn, a new day. It'll be fascinating to see how this plays out from a scheduling standpoint. With the Big Ten, as you guys well know, how they're gone without divisions going forward, and now it's got to scramble out how we figure all that out again.
How important have facilities been in all this, Coach, for Oregon's rise?
Well, huge in terms of getting people to visit for the longest time. Oregon is a small place from a population standpoint, small town, great college town where it's located, but not a ton of in-state talent. There's obviously exceptions to that. Justin Herbert being one of those guys. He made some headlines recently, but facilities. Again, Phil and Penny Knight having the ability to subsidize a lot of these options that they were thinking about here in the last couple of weeks.
What can you tell us about the rivalry with Washington? To what extent does that exist?
I think it's a good hate. It's a great hate. The Oregon State, Oregon-Washington rivalries, like I said, have been over both 100 years each, and it's a great, healthy hate. I know that Washington will be excited and in that corner of the map where they belong, kind of with the Michigans of the world, the Ohio States of the world, from an academic perspective and a football perspective. But it's, ton of respect for what they've done there.
The other one that strikes me as really interesting is the rivalry between Oregon and USC, and it's been to a large extent a recruiting rivalry. I mean, I know Oregon has gone heavily into Southern California and has lured away some top players. That's a huge priority for Lincoln Riley. For people who don't know about that, how real is that rivalry?
Well, it is real, and a ton of those kids, like I said, Oregon's basically 4 million people, I think, give or take. And so you go to a place like Southern California, and you try to recruit the right fits and find the right fits, or now sign the right fits, I guess you could say. And so that has changed, and these guys all know each other, whether it's 7-on-7 teams or certainly high school rosters or games against each other, and recruiting against each other. And hey, did you see this guy? Everybody knows each other in this deal, and it has been a great much more competitive rivalry than that was in the past.
Mark, last question for you. We've talked a lot about kind of the landscape and the bigger picture here for Oregon, but let's zero in on this team right now. I mean, they went 10-3 last year under Dan Lanning. They've got some really talented headlining players on this current roster. How good can Oregon be kind of this year and then immediately in the Big Ten?
Well, yeah, I think it starts and ends with Bo Nix. Newsflash: quarterback matters. And when he was healthy, they were really good. And just recently watched all their games from last season, and they have a great schedule. If you look at it from their perspective, this next season, that all hinges on his health and shoring up defensively. I know that was where they were trying to get most of the problems solved from last season.
Former Oregon head coach, current Fox Sports analyst Mark Helfrich. Coach, really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
All the best.
So that is Mark Helfrich. You take a look at the national championships at Oregon. I mentioned the incredible dominance as runners. Obviously, there's a great tradition there with Nike, and you talk about 32 of their 34 national championships have come either in track and field or cross country. Washington has a great rowing program, as I mentioned off the top, but they've won a couple of football national championships, and then a lot of these other national championships here have come in the 21st century: softball, volleyball, cross country, golf. So there's been some recent success in terms of the Olympic sports in Seattle. Let's get more reaction now from throughout the Big Ten on the addition of these two schools. Let's join Jerry DiNardo and Howard Griffith with their thoughts.
Thanks, Dave. And just when we thought expansion was done in the conference with USC and UCLA, news comes down that we gain Washington and Oregon. Your initial thoughts?
Well, it's a tough league now. It got tougher when we added UCLA and USC, and now it got even tougher. So if you look at the competitive balance, if you look at the recent histories of all the Big Ten schools, for some people, this is going to make it even harder to win. In other words, Howard, if you rank 1 through 16, if you add USC and UCLA, and you have, let's say, what people would consider the 5th best job in the Big Ten, right? Now you may have the 6th best job or the 7th best job. So these schools, UCLA, USC, Washington, Oregon, they slot into the 14. For a lot of teams in the conference, that's making it more competitive. So that's my first thought. The second thought is, especially with going to a 12-team playoff, most likely we'll go to 10 conference games because you can lose 2 games and still make the playoff. You add Oregon and Washington, you might be able to lose 3 games, 4 games, and still make the playoff. And the last thing I thought of when I heard this is we've been talking about the travel with USC and UCLA, right? This is the biggest problem with bringing on UCLA and USC. Now we bring up 2 more West Coast teams. It might be time to revisit East and West, to cut the travel down for the student athletes, and that certainly wouldn't be popular with most of the present East coaches.
I think the other thing that's interesting, and you talk about just the competitive balance, you just start to think about how athletic departments will now have conversations with their coaches, right? What are expectations going to be like? What should they be like? Because in this constant change, I think expectations also need to be addressed when you talk about hiring coaches and bringing coaches into your program.
Yeah, I think the way it would fit in expectations, if I'm at a school in the Big Ten that is perceived to have just been knocked down a peg, then the AD has to have a conversation with that coach saying it's tougher. If you're at the top of the league, expectations haven't changed, right? So, again, you look at 1 through 14, take UCLA, take USC, and slot them in there if you're a football junkie and you're ranking the best jobs. And now take those 16 schools and try to insert Oregon and Washington. I think that's how most fans are going to look at it. I guarantee you that's how most coaches are going to look at it. Where was I? Did I just move down? And if I didn't move down, I'm okay with it.
I wonder how it also would affect recruiting, right? You're starting to open up a new area, new regions to recruiting. Obviously, we know what's happened in Southern California, but now you're talking about the specific Northwest. So it's going to be a fun time. And I think you talk about two programs that are really rolling at a high level right now coming into the conference. It's going to be interesting to watch how that plays out as well.
I'd say if you went east and west, it would impact recruiting more if you divided it up. If you kept it nationally, I'm not so sure it would. But uncharted territory. We're going to see what happens.
Yeah, I think you mentioned travel. I think it gives your West Coast teams have some travel partners, but you still have to think about going east. Right, that's one of the things that jumps out.
Yeah, and you might be able to do that without dividing it back to east and west, but making it east and west again when these two teams come on really. And this isn't just about football; it's about all the other sports. It's about the sports that are played twice a week. I mean, you look at the travel that those student athletes are going to make. Play Rutgers if you're Oregon while you're there. Why don't you play Maryland and maybe Penn State, and come on back to campus next week.
Well, I think it's going to be really fun to watch just how it continues to play out. Obviously, scheduling is going to be a big part of it. They just did an entire 24-25 release, and that'll be redone. So this is interesting times, but this is what college football has come to.
No doubt.
Joined now by Nicole Auerbach, who has been following this story quite closely. Nicole, I want to ask you first, take us through today. Because to me, this is, someday the oral history of this day is going to come out, and I think it's just going to be utterly fascinating to find out what all the machinations were that led us to this point. In the best way that you can, take us through, let's say, the last 24 hours, starting with about this time yesterday.
This last day has been about a year of my life, I will say. It has just been absolutely crazy. I was talking to someone earlier, and I said, I don't remember the last time that there were just so many forks in the road, and it felt like everything was 50-50, and that different choices and different outcomes were all really on the table. And obviously, there were efforts within the Pac-12 and around the Pac-12 to try to keep that league and its most valuable schools together. And then there were also other opportunities for other schools. And we've known that Oregon and Washington were interested in coming to the Big Ten. They were willing to not come in at a full share to get here. And I think that a lot of things changed really Tuesday night. I think that's where you have to start going back, because that's when the Pac-12 was presented with their media rights deal, and all of the schools that have options started looking around and really reaching out and seeing what was possible. So as you had the efforts in the Pacific Northwest that ultimately culminated in this today, you also had those four corner schools and the Big 12. And so all of that was happening last night. We were tracking. I was staying up for the Arizona Regents meeting, and then you also had the Washington Regents meeting that were happening last night, trying to get a sense of it. But, earlier this morning, it felt like the Pac-12 was going to stay together, and then it felt like it wasn't. And so again,
what happened there? Because there was a lot of momentum early in the day of people saying, hey, I think the Pac-12 is going to be able to cobble this together.
Yes.
What was the notion that had changed? Because it seems like essentially the identical streaming deal, which had been presented to these schools earlier in the week, was presented again, and they were asked to vote on this grant of rights this morning. So why was there this thought that they may be able to hold it together? Like, what was the thought that was different?
I, again, would also love people to say a lot more about this, the decision makers that were directly involved as well. But I think there is a combination of really changing your mind and thinking about what is actually best for your school and the future moving forward, influences from the schools you might be leaving with or staying with, and then also figuring out with media partners what this would financially actually look like. And I think, there have been reports about what Washington and Oregon are going to get, how that will escalate, and then obviously when there is a new media deal, becoming a full member. And I think some of that comes in to ease the travel concerns and the costs.
Right. So I was going to ask you about the financial component of it, and we're fooling ourselves if we don't say that is the preeminent factor in all of this, right? So there has been a lot of different reporting. We've been on the air, frankly, while a lot of this has been unfolding. So what do you know? Bruce was on earlier and said something along the lines of like a half share, and then becoming a full share. Is that kind of where it stands?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to get a little bit more clarity myself exactly on how that changes. But you're essentially looking at money that is significantly more than what they would have gotten as a member of the Pac-12, and also more than what they would have gotten as a member of the Big 12, and that number that we've all heard so much about. And if it escalates, if it changes, and then again in 6 years when there's a new media deal, it'll be a full member. But I think you're talking about numbers in the 30s, and that is again a very significant difference than what the Pac-12 was looking at with that heavily streaming deal as well. And you're looking at the financial security of your athletic department. You want to be able to compete at the highest level in as many sports as possible, and that's a big difference.
Right. And again, this isn't a 6-year play for these schools, right? I mean, this is a 16, 26, 36-year play, right? I mean, presumably you're in it for as long a haul as you can possibly imagine. And so you don't think about it in terms of the immediate implications and maybe not being a full partner right off. You think about what it means in terms of not having to worry about any of this in the future.
Exactly. And when we think about, and I know Coach Meyer just referenced like 2 power conferences, and we think about, just the ability for the Big Ten to chart its own course moving forward with the SEC, right? And just knowing that you have financial security and that you are going to be able, no matter what happens in college sports, and there's so much uncertainty, but you will be able to fund the sports that matter the most, and that you will be able to offer the most amount of sports possible in everything. And so that's really important for a lot of these schools. And I think that's why, you had a lot of schools that would just crawl to get to the Big Ten and have that security later. I remember Greg Schiano said this at Media Days last year. Someone asked about USC and UCLA coming in as full share members. And, wasn't that so hard for Rutgers to take so long and not be able to start like that? And he said, wouldn't you rather be where we are now?
Right.
And so it is a long-term play, and it is about getting that security, getting in the door, and having those opportunities down the line when it's a full share, and we're talking $70-80 million.
Have a number of things I still want to get to with you. Urban was talking, and I thought really eloquently, and making a point that a lot of people have thought about here in the last year, and that is the Olympic sports.
Yes.
And the travel concerns. You wrote a great piece on The Athletic, I don't know, times maybe in the last week.
It was less than a week ago. It feels like it was 10 years ago. Yeah.
Yes, I have no idea. But it was really good, and it was really illuminating, and it was talking about how USC and UCLA were approaching this and what the scheduling model was going to be. Clearly, this alleviates at least a little bit of that, right? Because while, as I mentioned earlier with Jake, Eugene and Seattle are not around the corner from Los Angeles, these are already trips that they were making. And I think that it also makes it easier if you're coming from the Midwest or from the East to come out and play UCLA and USC. You would also have the possibility of playing Oregon and Washington as well. But what do you know about kind of where they are on schedule models and how this might impact it?
Yeah, I think football is the easy one, right? And anyone will tell you that, because football, you don't have as many games, and a lot of these teams are traveling around the country for non-conference. It's not as big of a deal. But when you're talking about soccer and field hockey, even basketball, it's a lot of games. And so you have to be really strategic about this. And everyone is thinking about how you do this from a scheduling standpoint. Do you pair teams or travel so that maybe you're playing Illinois and then Northwestern, and then you're flying out of O'Hare if you're flying commercial on that trip? So I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and kind of really being strategic to try to limit the lengths of the trips or the amount of the trips that they're going to have to take. And I think you're going to have to see that as well. But you could have these 4 members of the Pac-12. Obviously, there's history between playing each other and just a familiarity in how that travel works. Maybe they play each other twice in a round robin, and you play in those sports where it's not an even schedule. Maybe you lean into that and you play those opponents more frequently than you play the opponents out east. I think there's ways to play with this where it helps a little bit, but it is still going to be a daunting task for everyone.
We've talked a lot about money being a huge part of this equation, the biggest part of this equation. And of course, the money flows from television.
Yes.
And so it seems to me this gives you the ability now to open up another television window. I mean, whether that is a really late night window on the West Coast, whether it's during the week, or is it Friday night, or whatever it might be. What do you know about the viability of that kind of within this current construct? Is that something that can be done? Can you
Yes.
open another window in this 6-year time period of this contract coming up?
I think that's the goal. And I do expect that we'll get more clarity on that. And I think that Friday night window is something to watch. But also, we do know that that late window is an opportunity that doesn't exist for teams on the East Coast or in the Central Time Zone. And when you're adding teams from out West, they don't want to play in that window every single week. But it does give you some opportunities to put some games there in that you wouldn't otherwise have. But I do think the Friday night window is worth watching and just seeing, because you do have more inventory now. So how are you going to make sure that people see it? That is going to be one of the questions. And you're adding, a premier program in Oregon. People are going to want to see Oregon play Ohio State or Michigan and things like that. So how do you find those pockets as well to make sure that those games get the most amount of viewers as possible?
Oh, the games are really appetizing. I mean,
I
again,
can't
these
wait.
are really, really good programs. And no doubt these are games people are going to want to watch. There has been a lot of talk today, and we've had several guests talk about it. Like, as exciting a day as this is for the Big Ten, as exciting a day as it is for Oregon and Washington, I think it's tinged with a lot of sadness for a lot of people. For certain schools, it's cataclysmic.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a really brutal day if you are a fan of Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford, Cal, some of these programs that are kind of floating out there right now. What can you tell us about the potential fate of these schools that are kind of hanging in the balance right now?
We're still going to be waiting to see, I think, especially as we're waiting for those final steps to happen for the Big 12 and Arizona State, and Utah. But not all of the rest of the schools have options. Obviously, the Mountain West is out there, but that is a step down, right? We've been, Group of Five, Power Five. We've had that delineation. The interesting one for me is going to be, what about Stanford and Cal? These are programs that have been so successful in so many sports. They send so many Olympians to the Olympics representing the United States, and they have that academic prestige. And so I wonder if there's going to be opportunities for them in some sort of, I don't know even what to suggest. Is it a scheduling deal, agreement, independence, Mountain West? There's maybe going to be some avenues. They're not ideal, but I'm interested to see what happens there. We know the ACC had been in conversations with the Pac-12 in recent weeks and over the course of the last couple of years. So I don't know if that becomes an avenue of any possibilities with those types of schools, because those are academic-minded schools as well. So I don't know where this goes. And I think that's the really alarming part, is that these are schools that are so proud and have so much tradition. They give us such great rivalry games. And this is a conference that's been around for more than a century. It means a lot to a lot of people. So I think that is the overwhelming feeling for today. I think there's a lot of sadness among college football fans about watching a conference disintegrate in front of your eyes.
Mark Helfrich was talking about this too. I mean, Oregon and Washington have been in the Pac-12 or antecedent conferences since 1915.
Yeah.
1915, right? I mean, we talk about the proud history of the Big Ten, 1896. I mean, we're only talking about 20 years difference. Of course, we're talking about an area that was settled much later. So, I mean, this is woven into the fabric of that part of the country, and it really is tough to see. I'm fascinated by the Stanford one in particular, because by just about any measure, it's the most successful broad-based athletic program in the country. I mean, they win
the Directors' Cup every year.
Pretty much every year.
Yeah.
You're talking about a preeminent academic institution. You were mentioning the ACC, and the ACC, of course, has been hamstrung in all of this because the grant of rights goes out through 2036. So just to make it clear to people what that means, it means you could leave the ACC if you wanted to, but they maintain your television rights.
No one could see you. You could join the SEC, but no one can watch you.
Yes. So it really, for all intents and purposes, you're stuck there. What does it mean now if there were those other four schools hanging out there?
Yeah.
Like, could the ACC be in a position where either it expands to include those schools? Would that allow it potentially to get out of that grant of rights? Or could they just form some sort of scheduling agreement? Like, what does all this mean for the ACC?
It's such an interesting question. Honestly, the ACC corner of realignment has been the most interesting to me over the last few weeks because of that grant of rights. And you've had Florida State making a lot of noise about potentially trying to get out of it or challenge it. But until somebody successfully challenges it, I think you have to assume that all of those schools are pretty locked in to where they are. But Jim Phillips, the commissioner of the ACC, he's also from Big Ten country. We know him from Northwestern. He said last week that they were open to expansion and looking for other revenue streams. So that does make me think, well, is there something you can do from a scheduling standpoint or potentially adding? And is there a way to do that without allowing your biggest brands the opportunity to leave? And I think that's the big question. I think that they think if they think there's a way to do it without suddenly opening the gates and people can leave, I think it's worth exploring.
Right, that's the flip side of it, right?
Yeah.
So if you do somehow find, I mean, it seems like whoever the lawyers were who worked on the ACC's grant of rights, like a tip of the cap, because
Maryland can take some credit for that too.
I mean, it seems like it's airtight, but you're right. Then, like, if you do figure out some sort of wiggle room to add, does that
just
then
make sure you can't lose at that as well?
This is the statement for the Big Ten. Earlier today, the Council of Presidents and Chancellors voted to admit the University of Oregon and the University of Washington to the conference effective August 2nd, 2024, with competition to begin in all sports for the 2024-2025 academic year. With the school's admission, Oregon and Washington will also join the Big Ten Academic Alliance, a consortium of world-class research institutions dedicated to advancing their academic missions. Let's hear from the president of the University of Oregon now, John Carl Scholes.
Earlier today, the Big Ten Conference invited us to become a member of the Big Ten. The Big Ten is not only a remarkably strong athletic conference, it is one of the premier academic conferences in the country. Indeed, I would say it is the finest academic athletic conference in the country. By inviting the University of Oregon to be a member of the Big Ten, we have opportunity to accelerate our extraordinary record of innovation and success on the playing field, as well as to enhance significantly the academic reputation of the university.
We have a full house now in the studio. Jake rejoining us, and for the first time today, we see Anthony Herron fought his way through the Lollapalooza traffic to.
It took a bit. It took a minute.
Come hang out with us. We haven't been able to hear from you yet today, Anthony. First time we've seen you on our air. Give us a sense of the impressions for you of this day and what this has meant.
It's a day that I think all of us in a variety of ways have been sort of discussing the potential for this day for weeks, for months, maybe even a couple of years, depending on what angle you come at it from. And I venture to say that there may be no one in the industry who has, between radio and television, games, studios, who've covered the two conferences, the Big Ten and the Pac-12, as extensively as I have. And I am so excited for folks who've been fans of the Big Ten for all these years, who maybe haven't been to Husky Stadium, who perhaps haven't been to Autzen Stadium, who haven't sailgated before, to now have the opportunity to experience these two magnificent atmospheres. I've called games at both of these stadiums over the years. The fan bases are spectacular. And the way that they do combine, as we just heard a moment ago, the academic and the athletic. We've seen that the Big Ten and the Pac-12 have been sort of evenly yoked in that regard, with the influence on each end of the campuses there in a few different ways in recent years here. And so now you have 4 teams that will be in 2024 a part of the Big Ten that historically have been in the Pac-12 conference. And it feels like in a number of ways that this makes sense.
You did work, as you said, at the Pac-12 networks for many years. Yeah. I'm not sure everyone who's watching knows that, but they know it now. So, yeah, give us a little more insight. Like, what's a game at Autzen like? What's a game at Husky Stadium like with Sailgate? I mean, the setting is unbelievable. I've never actually been to a game there. I've been to a game at Autzen, never been to one at Husky Stadium, but I've seen the setting for it. I've done basketball there. It's incredible.
It is, and it's a part of where, when you think of the domino effect, that I know like Nicole's been talking about it in great detail, and Jake was earlier, of how things have played out in recent years here. And there was a lot. There was like this tectonic shift in recent years when Urban Meyer came to the Big Ten and really revamped, enhanced the way that the Big Ten as a conference resourced football and really, frankly, athletics in general. That eventually began to filter out to the West Coast, to the Pac-12. And Oregon and Washington are two of the athletic departments that really made it a point to say, we need to emphasize things. We know what Phil Knight began to do. He even shifted into another gear to, frankly, try and keep up with. I was at the Pac-12 network. We know how things went there early on.
There were a lot of resources into the Pac-12 network. There were resources into the personnel, into the campuses, into the programs, the football teams that are a part of each of these institutions. And the atmosphere at Alton Stadium, it's not the biggest stadium in the world, but it is packed game in and game out. When they have the opportunity to do so, if there were rafters at Alton Stadium, they would hang from them on game day. And I've been out there interacting with fans at tailgate times before the games. And when you have the duck that comes out before the game and riding out there on the motorcycle, I'm telling you, man, it sends chills through your spine when you get to experience that. And there's not every atmosphere in the Pac-12 that maybe rivals what we're accustomed to in the Big Ten. But Oregon, and then at Husky Stadium as well with the Huskies, with Washington, those are two that have fan bases that are rabid enough that really do rival what we, in some ways, maybe even take for granted in the Big Ten.
So, Nicole, with all that being said, how does this change the perception of the Big Ten now, do you think, nationally?
Well, I mean, I think everyone thought that this was a league everyone wanted to be a part of to begin with, and I think this is also a conference that, is going to be extremely competitive at the top. And you're going to be looking at an era of a 12-team college football playoff with a lot of at-large bids. And you're going to have a lot of teams in this league that are going to be contending for that. That was actually one of the reasons people weren't sure if Oregon wanted to leave the Pac-12. Maybe it was an easier path to get to the playoff. It is going to be challenging, and it's great for us because we get to watch like Oregon play Ohio State and Washington play Michigan, and these be league games. But you already had an uphill battle getting into the top half of this conference, and it's going to be harder. And so I think you're going to really be talking about the depth, the top and the middle of this league, and again the influx, the money and the resources in this conference. A lot of people will have very high expectations for themselves.
The strength of these programs on the field, I think that's one of those things that can maybe be underappreciated, Jake, because in recent years, we see what Oregon was able to do on the field against Ohio State in recent years. Just last season, we saw what Washington was able to do to Michigan State. Now, they're going to have to travel to Spartan Stadium, probably one of the more underrated atmospheres in the country. But these are two programs, and frankly, the Pac-12 as a whole is really going to have a great season this year. They got a lot of big-time quarterbacks there. Washington and Oregon bring two of those veterans to the table this year. But these are two football programs that are ascending at a time as they enter the Big Ten.
Those two matchups, as I was thinking about it, they kind of gave us a snapshot. Remember Oregon, Ohio State, and Washington, Michigan State. Just think about the buzz of those matchups the week leading up to it and bringing these two brands, what that means going forward. And Nicole, you bring up a good point, the timing of this, of the expanded playoff. What that means from a scheduling standpoint. In a 4-team playoff, 1 loss is your floor, 2 losses, you're really out. 12 teams, there's so much more flexibility to put good on good. And anytime there's implications, that adds to the buzz, that adds to the excitement, everything surrounding these games. So the timing of these editions has me excited as well.
And of course, there was so much time spent on working through the football schedule that was unveiled here a few weeks ago.
We thought that work was done. There was no longer a period.
It was great. Ascertain who everyone's rivals were. I think these were all true rivalries. You had some schools that didn't have any, and some, Iowa, one in particular, that had 3.
What's the next iteration beyond Flex Protect Plus?
The Flex
is it
Protect Plus.
Is it double plus?
Plus.
What do they do next?
Okay, so Nicole, I guess I defer to you initially. Sure. Have you heard anything here? Like Jerry was suggesting maybe you go back to divisions. Now, would that make sense both in terms of travel and just in terms of the sheer size of it? I mean, so many tiebreakers, I would think, in trying to figure out, who ultimately ends up as the top 2 teams. Maybe you do go to that. What's your sense of what people are thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do that, and you can make a case for that. But I also think it then becomes a little bit more challenging with who draws the short end of the stick to have to travel out west and be part of that division or pod or whatever you're describing it, because 18 doesn't exactly work for 2 divisions, maybe 3, but you'd still have to look at like a Nebraska or Minnesota or somebody else to have to do that travel. So maybe you look at a variation of the Flex Protect Plus, and you try to keep the competitive balance and the rivalries, and then you just take the 2 best teams at the end of the year. I mean, I think there's different options. I don't think you have to go to divisions, and I've heard mixed opinions on what people want to do, but I think you could actually take the principles that already existed that we just spent a lot of time learning about and apply them to adding Oregon and Washington.
And when we've heard Tony Petitti, Kerry Kenny, AJ Eads kind of describing everything that went into making this current version of the schedule, schedule, they all talked about how it'll continue to be versatile and malleable as we kind of get through the next few seasons here, and hoping to keep some sort of a round-robin aspect to it. I think it's a great goal. It, of course, becomes more and more difficult the more teams you add. When Jake and I each had played in the Big Ten, there was an opportunity more so for me 20-plus years ago where I was able to hit every single campus in the conference. That will increasingly become more and more difficult throughout a 4 or 5 year career.
Well, that was going to happen in the Flex Protect Plus, right? You were going to play at every school in the Big Ten at least once in 4 years. You were protecting the rivalries. I think to your guys' point, I mean, we haven't been able to sit down and put a pen to paper yet and try to figure out exactly how it would work. But I think there's certain principles that have to be in play. And I think the Big Ten had them exactly right with this schedule that came out here within the last month or so. And the notion is you should play those teams that are clearly your rivals every year. And then you should make sure that you get the opportunity to play everyone else in the league and to travel to those venues. Whether or not that's possible with 18 teams, you'd have to go through all the permutations of it. But the notion of that, I think, was a really strong one, and one that my sense is they would look to continue.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, Jake made a good point earlier about having a little more wiggle room with a 12-team playoff. One of the things that Tony Petitti had been talking about that scheduling model was scheduling to make sure that you had multiple teams that would have the type of resume that would get them into the playoff, or at least considered for the playoff. You could still do that with an expanded Big Ten, because the idea was that you're not overburdening anyone, but you are having your best teams play some of the best teams so that their strength of schedule, opportunities for marquee wins, all of that is part of it. I think you could still take that principle even when you're adding these brands, and the schedule's going to look even harder.
That does let me exhale a little bit, sort of to that point where now there are 4 Pacific time zone teams. And that was certainly one of the concerns that a lot of us had talked about for a while. But now not only the LA schools, Jake, but now you add Oregon and Washington, and the ability now to have 4 preeminent football brands. UCLA, it's underappreciated. I think UCLA, I've said this a number of times on various platforms. On the line of scrimmage, UCLA is probably even more prepared for Big Ten football right now. But having 4 different programs in the Pacific time zone, however things end up getting divided up from a scheduling perspective, you will at least say that we're able to have a diminished travel burden versus what some of us have maybe been talking about over the past year. So this, for me, who did have concerns about that, I do exhale a bit now knowing that there's a couple of other Pacific time zone teams. And it's not just anyone. These aren't also ran programs. These are great teams being added in that same time zone.
We have insurance in that sense. And I think as far as the schedule, as you look at the schedule going forward, we know one thing, that the future is uncertain. So the more you can build in where it's appropriate, flexibility into the scheduling, I just think that'll benefit you long term. We have some time. I trust Tony Petitti. And the conference is in a great position right now. You almost can't lose. So just do the right things and build in flexibility. And man, at the end of the day, we're going to see some excellent matchups.
Right, and I mean, I guess one of the byproducts of today is there's one more at-large bid in the college football playoffs, right? Presumably.
Yeah. Well,
right?
we'll have to see. Yeah, we'll have to see how that gets adjusted.
How that plays out, or maybe not. I mean, maybe you just say, well, it's going to still be it's still going to be the top 6 highest-rated conference champions, and you just had everyone move up a little bit on the pecking order. However, they decide to play it out. It does seem like there are. Look, I think even before this happened, the expectation was the Big Ten would get 2 or 3 teams in a normal year. Now you look at the number of teams that conceivably could compete for this, and it really makes your head spin of how deep and good this league could be.
When I saw James Franklin in Indy, he said, let's not push for 6. Let's push for 8 teams, 10 teams from the Big Ten to make the college football playoff once it expands to 12. So I don't know. Now an 18-team league, maybe get 12, 14, 16 teams in the playoff. Why not?
Well, perhaps James got a little bit carried away there, but you do think
I don't want to cover those meetings again.
But you do think, I mean, look, from the perspective of Penn State, from the perspective of all these teams in the East, I mean, irrespective of what we're doing here with the expansion to the West Coast, the notion of the expanded playoff and the notion, frankly, of going away from the divisions help them immeasurably. Right. I mean, it gives them an opportunity to get themselves in. Olympic sports-wise, I mean, you've talked a little bit about this, Anthony. Your wife played an Olympic sport at the University of Iowa. What's your take on what this means in that world?
This at least allows more of an opportunity now for sort of that potted sort of scheduling format like Nicole was addressing here, because football, it was going to be easy enough in football to set up some version of that with one game a week. The inventory on the whole is very manageable in that regard, but the sports that play a broader volume of games that aren't accustomed to traveling, in a way that has a lot of chartered flights. It's one thing that Martin Jarman was talking about, the UCLA athletic director, and saying that he was going to make sure that all the UCLA sports would have at least the potential for charter, the access to charters for at least some of their sports teams. And we'll see what Oregon and Washington are going to do in that regard as well. But the additional time zone, it's one thing for the mileage that can be a part of this conversation, but traveling multiple time zones for athletes, that to me is an even bigger deal than the mileage. And so now having multiple Pacific time zone teams who are going to be in the mix as well, it lightens that load. It lessens that burden on Olympic sports that are playing more games in a weekend, let alone in a full season.
Yeah, and talking to people at USC and UCLA, there's been so much focus, and you talked about this in your article as well, so much focus on the body clock, so much focus on nutrition and sleep. Obviously, the fact that people are taking classes online now, yeah. I think that changes that part of the equation dramatically. It doesn't seem quite as burdensome because this is just kind of the way that this generation is used to learning. You don't necessarily think about sitting in the classroom for every class.
It's fair. It's a fair point to make, but my junior year in 2015, we went out to Utah week 1. And we went across multiple time zones and an elevation, and that was a night game. So by the time that game wrapped up, it was 1:30 in the morning back home. You're in college. This is what you love to do. There's a heavy adrenaline aspect of it. I wasn't yawning or sleeping or anything, and you get back the next day and you do what you need to do, and there's a little ramp up period. But this is just part of being a high level athlete, right? And it's part of it. It's even fun too. It's a challenge to go across and play in these new environments. So you got to address it. There is some time zone issues, but I don't think it ever made a huge impact, at least in my experience when I was playing.
And that being said, you're going to have to be cognizant of it if you're putting together that schedule. And I think the fact that they're already thinking about it and the fact that you now have 2 more schools in that time zone, I do think it helps you significantly.
Yeah, and when I was reporting out that story, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that, Martin Jarman, you mentioned him, was calling around to NFL teams that do this, that play across time zones. Seattle, they have the most travel in the NFL, so obviously that's going to be a sounding board, you would think, for Washington. But it is about trying to minimize the total number of trips and then figure out what you do when the length of the trip is longer. And so, for that, are you adding more academic advisors that are coming with you? Are you staying on a West Coast sleep schedule? How are you handling nutrition to make sure you're fueled? These are all the big questions, and they go into that athlete experience because you are going to be asking a lot of those athletes to be making longer trips just to play conference games.
Especially in basketball, in softball, in sports that just play dozens and dozens of games throughout a year. That can eventually wear on your body clock in that way. And I think that from a football perspective, even as we see, what other leagues end up doing, what happens with the ACC, if the SEC feels like they need to respond to this move by the Big Ten, then there's still the potential for how that impacts the college football playoff may eventually, as we get to, a year from today, who knows, the landscape could continue to look a little bit different. And then if that's the case, the college football playoff and those conversations will end up, evolving, and we'll have to all follow Nicole on Twitter and make sure that we're just refreshing our timelines, waiting for her to tell us what's happening next.
Let me sleep.
No, you are not allowed to sleep.
Finally got some official announcements here.
We're worried about the student athlete sleep. The sleep we should really be worried about is Nicole Auerbach sleep. Right?
Thank you.
Let's just be honest.
This is sarcastic, but I will appreciate the effort.
I'm a staunch believer that you need to get some rest. Again, the story of the day, the Big Ten is now the even bigger 10. Oregon and Washington joining the league. It will be at 18 teams starting not this coming season, but the season after, 2024. The largest football conference in the history of college sports and the largest athletic conference overall in the current landscape at 18. So great to have you with us as we continue here on Big Ten Live. Dave Revson, Nicole Auerbach, Anthony Herron, and Jake Butt. Really a huge day. And if you're just joining us and kind of aren't totally up on how this happened. Nicole has been following it very closely. So just kind of take us through the time frame, last 24 hours, how we got from uncertainty to this moment.
I'm going to start you back a little bit further even, because really a lot of what changed here is Colorado deciding to leave the Pac-12 a week ago. And that started to create some instability within the Pac-12, which had not yet signed their next media rights deal. They had a meeting on Tuesday where they were presenting the framework to the deal to everyone else, which I guess we could call the Pac-9 at that time. After that, everything else pretty much ramped up, and the schools that had options to go elsewhere started to pursue those options. So we've all been aware of the other corner schools, the four corner schools. So Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah appear headed to the Big 12. That could be final by the end of tonight. And meanwhile, Oregon and Washington have been interested in the Big 10 for a long time. And we know that they have been trying, they have been vetted, they have been looked at, they have been explored by the Big 10. But the Big 10 did not add them before. And now I think what you're looking at is the possible dissolution of the Pac-12 and what does that change? And I think for the Big 10, you're looking at these two valuable brands. They are AAU schools, they are academic, the profile, everything works for the Big 10 except for the distance, right? So you're trying to figure out, is it worth it to add? Does it help at all with the other sports and the travel, USC, UCLA? Does it give them a place to go if the Pac-12 is no longer? And so I think you saw a lot of those conversations escalate, as well as the opportunity to get Oregon and Washington and not have to pay them a full share right away. We've seen this with Maryland and Rutgers and other schools in the past in the Big Ten's history. But what that does is allows you to figure out all of these things, find media partners, find the money to make it viable, but then figure out what this is all going to look like in an 18-member league at full shares the next time you do a deal in 6 years.
It feels like it's making the best of a rather chaotic, situation that we've all been following so closely all around intercollegiate athletics, and to be able to add the brands of the Oregon Ducks and the Washington Huskies. And to be clear, Oregon and Washington, when you're comparing the situation the Pac-12 has been in with the Big 12, the two conferences who seem to have been teetering more than others here in recent months, Oregon and Washington get more eyeballs than any of the remaining teams in the Big 12. With the Big 12 losing Texas and Oklahoma, there are no brands in the Big 12 that remained that rival Oregon and Washington. And it didn't seem like the Big 10, from any discussions I've had, it didn't feel like the Big 10 wanted to continue to sort of destabilize things around the country. This is a conference that really values tradition, while at the same time having the opportunity to boost up these brands and the value that they can add to the Big Ten and what the Big Ten can do in support of Oregon and Washington. And by comparison to any other programs that remained here, these are really the two most prominent that are remaining or that were remaining before the Big Ten ended up making this move.
You brought up some good points, because I think it was really beautifully executed considering how chaotic it's been. Because when this first started, even last year with USC and UCLA, that there was, hey, is there going to be further expansion? And it was continually brought up that if that is the case, it can't take away from the others. So how do you work out that equation? And it's a situation where Oregon and Washington win and the Big Ten wins. And then you mentioned the TV markets. Big audiences out there. I know we just signed a new TV deal. There will be a new negotiation in the future. So those markets alone, as well as the matchups, just means the potential for exponential growth.
And I think what's also important as you think about how it works for both sides is that Oregon and Washington will be making more money by being partial shares in the Big Ten than they would have with the Pac-12 or what they would have with the Big 12. And so that's why this move makes a lot of sense, even if you can't get a full share. It gets you in the door. And that is something that Oregon and Washington have really wanted. But the instability across the landscape, not wanting to be part of the reason that the Pac-12 meets its demise. These are reasons that people have really been wrestling with this week. It's been a really challenging 24 hours where there were different points where I thought the Pac-12 might survive and then I thought this might happen and then maybe this wasn't going to happen. It really was something that went back and forth, and it felt very much like, you're picking which road you're going to go down, and I didn't know which road people were going to go down.
I mean, it's so fascinating if you take it back even further and you think about when Jim Delaney tried to set up a scheduling agreement with the Pac-12 more than a decade ago, and that was kind of his notion of expanding without expanding, that you were expanding the footprint of the Big Ten into the Western United States. That the notion of it, for those who have forgotten, was that you would pair off every year and you would play one game in the non-conference against one of the schools from the other league. And Commissioner Delaney was bullish on this, and the Pac-12 ended up standing in the way of it because they were playing 9 conference games at that time. The Big Ten was only playing 8, and the feeling was it was too much for them, particularly schools that also had a high-profile non-conference opponent. USC and Stanford every year would play Notre Dame, and then you were going to play a Big Ten school, and it just felt like it was too much. Ultimately, you wonder whether the seeds of the Pac-12's demise actually began with them backing out of that agreement.
There's a lot of different points that I think if you're doing a timeline of key moments, that is certainly one. I think, obviously the efforts around their media deals, the last time the Pac-12 network visibility problems and distribution problems that led to this point. And then just, again, allowing the Big 12 to be an aggressor. We talked about this earlier, but, for 2 years ago, a lot of people left the Big 12 for dead. And then they were able over the last year to say, we are stable. We are a better option for schools in the Pac-12, those 4 corner schools. And they were able to get Colorado. And when that happened, that changed things. So it's been a week. It feels like a year. But that's because the Big 12 did create stability, did stick together. And then that changed the landscape. And the Big Ten's been in a good position where we know they didn't have to add if they didn't want to. So they were able to be picky. But because of the way other people did not have that luxury, we got to this point.
There's a lot of great athletic departments that have been in the Pac-12 historically, but the situation the Big Ten finds itself in right now, having USC and UCLA on the way in. Yes, the LA market, a huge part of what's exciting about that as well. But just from a football perspective, the histories, the Heismans, and everything else that comes with the Trojans and the Bruins. And now you end up bolstering that with more teams in the Pacific time zone, more out on the West Coast with Oregon, with Washington. Oregon here over the last few decades has maybe been as consistent as any athletic department that's been out on the West Coast, and Washington has been very underrated, I would say, in a way where folks don't recognize it. Yes, they played in the college football playoff. They've had teams that have been of national championship caliber at various times of recent vintage here. And just the atmosphere, a lot of folks don't recognize the pageantry that you can access in the West Coast, in the Pacific time zone, out in what has been historically thought of as the Pac-12. I was telling you guys a little while ago, man, there's not a stadium that's currently in the Pac-12 that I haven't called multiple games in. And I don't know that there's anyone other than these 4 that I would say I would put at the top of the list for the history, for the fanaticism that's there when their teams are rolling. I mean, it's going to be fun. I cannot wait until you are calling games in Husky Stadium. I cannot wait until Dave and Nicole are out there finding reasons. I was talking to my wife a little bit earlier. She never made it out to Seattle. When I was sailgating, she's excited to come sailgating with me finally because we missed that window from my time calling Pac-12 football. Man, there's a lot that goes into it, and I understand I have friends who've been texting me. There are some melancholy notes that are to this, no doubt. But in the end, college football will be here, college football will thrive, and now the Big Ten gets to add these additional brands, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, you said this, Dave, and it's not, we didn't just wake up last week and be like, oh, whoa, we're here. Like, this was set in motion a long time ago, and we've just been working our way, and then here we are, and the situation is, it's just the situation. It's where we were at. It's where Oregon was at. It's where Washington, the Pac-12, and then Big Ten found themselves in a situation as well, for every reason we just said, where the partnership of these 2 schools and the ability now for those athletic departments to sleep easy at night. You are in a stable ship going forward in this conference, and even strengthens an already strong conference in the Big Ten Conference.
I think it shows the strength, right, Dave? Just where the Big Ten hasn't had to be necessarily the aggressor in these scenarios, but the strength of this conference shows in the fact that the Big Ten has been able to respond because the Big Ten is such a desired brand. So many other athletic departments, so many other programs want to be a part of the Big Ten, understandably. So we all benefit from being a part of the Big Ten, but there hasn't had to be sort of this aggressive posture or an urgency until it's been necessary. There's been able to be a responsive posture from the Big Ten because there hasn't necessarily been, I don't believe, a desire to continue to shift or destabilize or have other conferences go away. But when this opportunity was here, it seems like the Big Ten has now had 4 of these institutions that they've added here in recent years that'll join in 2024 that seem to me to be the 4 best options that were on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And 4 institutions that sought them out, right? I mean, that was the story a year ago with UCLA and USC. Now, I do think it's important to note that kind of all of that was set into motion by the SEC adding Oklahoma and Texas. It feels like in this kind of massive shakeup here in the last year, that was the first domino to fall, and then UCLA and USC were beginning to sense the instability of the Pac-12 and made the the move to the Big Ten, sent out the feelers that ultimately ended with them landing in the conference. I mentioned the SEC, and I'm fascinated to see. So, they obviously are adding Texas and Oklahoma starting next year. What then for the SEC? So that would then be a 16-team league. Do you believe they're done there, or do you believe then that goes back to our prior discussion about the ACC?
I think the SEC has been much more shutting this talk down over the last year. Greg Sankey has been pretty consistent about saying, we want to be a 16-team league. They were able to move up. They were able to get Oklahoma and Texas a year early, so all of these moves are all going to align next summer. And even this week, Greg Sankey has said the same. I mean, that they are good at 16. They're happy where they are. And I think the door was always a little bit more open in the Big Ten because we know what happened last summer. We know there's been people exploring or interested in continuing out west. The SEC has also been very tied to the region. They have not been interested in the schools out west and the travel and the logistics and everything that the Big Ten is doing. And they take pride in the fact that all their states touch. So that does limit you, right? If the ACC schools are in their grant of rights, no one's challenged it, no one's successfully challenged it, then there's not a lot of schools that are available. So I think that does lend itself to the idea that maybe the SEC does go to 16 and sees how that is, and that we waits for whatever fallout there might be in the ACC. But I don't think that they were interested in going out west.
And that grant of rights that you referenced in the ACC, that's where everyone's sort of waiting and seeing how that will play out legally, how that will play out, even if you have those 7 teams that have been sort of, maneuvering and making maybe the biggest threats to go, then how that ends up impacting things. And I think for the SEC, they do have, at least in football, that recruiting advantage for their footprint, their fan base, while rabid is far more regional than this national fan base that the Big Ten is known for. There's a reason that the Big Ten is the most lucrative conference while not being, in football, the one that wins the majority of the national championships. So there's an interesting balance to the decision making that'll go, I think, for the SEC. But, on the field of play in football, the Big Ten now, to me, is strengthened even more because you know how important recruiting is. And so that national footprint, that landscape that the Big Ten can now access, and the revenue certainly doesn't hurt, but now you've got that Big Ten brand that feels even more national than it already was in adding the LA schools.
I think it's an important question, though, Dave, to ask because it provides a distinction in some perspective. It can get lost here and misinterpreted that this expansion is something that's aggressively happened, and you used the passivity from the Big Ten from acting in a point of leverage. And Nicole, you just touched on it with the SEC. It's slow. It's not like there's frantic moves being made, like further expansion is being discussed. In order for that to happen, there has to be things that really aren't. You mentioned the Bill of Rights with the ACC. That's going to be a roadblock from a lot of those teams. And then from the Big Ten and the SEC standpoint, if you add again, it has to be an addition. You can't just add for the sake of adding. Both conferences are in good places.
What about Notre Dame? Notre Dame is still sitting out here in football independence, which, of course, it prides itself on. That has been historically where Notre Dame has wanted to be. There have certainly been overtures through the years. They kind of remain, I think, the one that hangs out there that any league would fall all over itself to get.
Sounds very romantic. Overtures. There have been a lot of those to Notre Dame over the years.
Plenty of overtures. Does any of this impact them, Nicole, or does this just all come down to, for Notre Dame, the amount of money they're able to get from NBC?
There's a couple different factors, I think, that play in to Notre Dame's independence, because they do want to be independent. It is incredibly important to them as a school, beyond athletics, that they are independent. I do think anyone would make room and figure it out if they were suddenly interested. But it is making sure that you have enough money coming in to fund the sports that are the biggest deals and that you're able to compete at the highest level. So I don't think you need to match the dollar figures of your peers in the Big Ten and the SEC, but you need to be in the ballpark so that you can compete with them, because you're always going to be prioritizing stuff a little bit differently, and you're going to take essentially like a tax to stay independent, but that's worth it to you. You also need to be able to access the playoff, and we know that with the model that has been proposed and approved, they will do that. There's 6 at-large spots every single year. You do not need to be a conference champion, so they've got that checked. The third piece to me is the one to watch as conferences get bigger and bigger, and that is the schedule. If Notre Dame can't play the teams that they want to, then you maybe feel squeezed and you feel like you need to join a league. And by the way, a lot of the teams that they like to play every year are in the Big Ten.
Right.
Just like that's an aside. But that's the piece. Because if everyone will work with you and play you and you can have your national schedule and your rivals, then there's no pressing need for Notre Dame to join a conference.
The Irish have never had an issue getting money from their own individual TV deal. And to your point, Nicole, everyone wants to play Notre Dame because folks have that advantage. Folks benefit from facing the Irish on the playing surface because they come with TV eyeballs, they come with butts in the seats. And so all that ends up mattering. I do believe, I'll be curious to watch how, as more teams are consolidated into a few different conferences, as more influence is consolidated into right now the Big Ten and the SEC. But right now, there are still a couple of other autonomous conferences, power conferences, whatever term we end up using there. Does the discussion around perhaps trying to freeze Notre Dame out of the playoff, does that become easier to have if there's not as many conferences of influence there? And then you just have a few of the power brokers who can say, all right, someone wants to get Notre Dame in their league, and perhaps it can happen if you just have a few conferences of power and influence as opposed to so many others who Notre Dame can kind of cherry pick who they want to play. Because
I don't
they have
know
such
if you
a
want to
national
strong
schedule.
arm them, though, into convincing them to come to your league.
Yeah.
Maybe you do it in a
That would be
nicer
the only way it would
nicer
happen
way.
if folks said, we'll freeze them out of our schedule. But up till now, no one's wanted to do that because people love to play Notre Dame.
Right, and I think at a certain point, kind of to your point, it becomes less about freezing out and maybe just like there isn't room, right? I mean, but again, I mean, I think everyone agrees. People like playing Notre Dame, right, because of the visibility that it brings you, and just because they are one of the few truly national brands in really all of sport.
I think the question becomes, if these conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, get bigger, do they want to play more conference games?
Right.
And that becomes part of the way that you squeeze out because you've got all these teams. You want to play each other. Right. Like, don't you want them to play each other more frequently? I think that's a valid question.
On a long enough time scale, I mean, there's points where we can say, like, hey, this is a possibility where you have two super conferences of the Big Ten and the SEC. And then at that point, they can almost dictate their own rules. They can almost say, hey, it's our playoff. And in a sense, maybe without, fully washing them out, say, hey, listen, this is what we're doing. Would you like to join us? You're welcome.
So we have a few minutes left before we're going to wrap things up. I'm just kind of interested from each one of you. Maybe, Jake, I can start with you. Your biggest takeaway from today, the biggest thing you'll remember about this day and what kind of you think about all of this moving forward.
My biggest takeaway is that the only constant is change. Right? You never relax too much, especially in sports. There's constantly change. But I think we're going to look back on this a couple years from now as a historic moment in college football, certainly in our conference and for these two schools. And with where they're at, and even USC, UCLA, all of them have brand new coaches. All of them are trending in an excellent national contender direction. So we'll look back at this day as a strong point for the conference and a pivotal point for college football as a whole.
One of the things I've tried to remind folks of a decent bit over the last couple of years, as so much has changed around college football and intercollegiate athletics, is just the notion of all this dis-ease and all this change that's going on. And especially a lot of the reaction tends to go towards the student athletes and the fact that they can switch schools and go to the transfer portal. And that tends to get some negativity with it, and name, image, and likeness and maximizing their personal brand, the compensation that goes with that can get some negative reaction. Folks are getting more accustomed to it. And I think a day like this, as great as it is for the Big Ten Conference, we certainly remember, and I know it's been noted throughout the day, it is about money. It is about the revenue that's generated for these institutions, for this conference. And so I guess I would urge folks to remember that. Whenever you see some athlete having a name, image, and likeness deal and you say, oh, well, maybe I'm not comfortable with that kid doing that. Remember that there are a lot of other folks who are creating revenue, who are maximizing their brands as leagues, as universities, and that's part of what makes me feel very comfortable with the players having the opportunity to do that as well.
Yeah, I think for me, the main takeaway that I have is just that, yes, there's always going to be change, but these are steps about the future of college sports. These are people looking 10, 20 years down the road and securing that future, because that stratification of the top of college sports and the middle and the bottom, it's only going to get greater. And so I think this is going to be one of those days when you look at how do we get from point A to point B 30 years from now, this is one of those days.
There's so many different things that could be said about today, and I think you have done a great job, along with our guests, of articulating basically all of them. I'll just say this, the games are going to be great.
So good.
I mean, they are going to be really good, and we look forward to covering them here on the Big Ten Network.